Welcome to the Asia Society Policy Institute's webinar on the economic impacts of the Iran war to Asia. I'm Wendy Cutler, Senior Vice President at ASPI, and I welcome you here today. We have an excellent panel from across the Asian region, from the Philippines, Indonesia, Japan, and Australia. First, allow me to introduce Tatsuya Terazawa, who's now Chairman and CEO of the Institute of Energy Economics in Japan, one of the world's leading energy think tanks. He previously served as vice minister at METI, and that's where I got to know him well. So it's good to see you again, Terazawa-san.
My pleasure to see you.
Next,
Actually, when maybe it was still MITI at the time.
It was METI. Okay, METI. Okay, sorry. Okay. Next, Dr. Matteo Lanzafame is joining us from the ADB. He's director of the Macroeconomics Research Division there, where he leads the team responsible for the production of the Asian Development Outlook, a really important publication that helps the Asia Society kind of sort through all of these economic developments. So thank you so much for joining us. We're also joined by Julia Tiaya, hopefully I pronounced your name correctly, a non-resident fellow at a think tank in Indonesia called CSIS, and formerly with the ASEAN Secretariat. And finally, but last but not least, Jenny Gordon, the now honorary professor at the Center for Social Research at the Australian National University, and former chief economist at Australia's DFAT, is joining us. So with that, let's get right into our discussion. And what I would like to kind of ask each panelist the same question to kind of get the table set here. And that is, I'd be interested in your reactions to the deal that was announced between the US and Iran, not the particulars of the deal itself, but more focusing on the announcement that the Strait of Hormuz would be reopened and what this could mean for Asia in the coming weeks and months. How do you see things unfolding? And do you see the economic situations then improving as goods start flowing out of the Strait of Hormuz? So Matteo, over to you first.
So many thanks, Wendy and ASPI in general, for inviting me. So let me start by saying that obviously this is very good news for Asia. The fact that we have an agreement and potentially a peace deal that is going to be upheld and implemented. As you were saying at the beginning, I mean, this is a global shock, but it's really a bigger shock for Asia than it is for other areas in the world. The Strait of Hormuz is where roughly 20% more or less of oil and LNG transit, global oil and LNG transit, and 80% of that ends up in Asia. So that's a big shock for Asia. So the fact that we have this deal obviously is very important. Now the question is how long it's actually going to take for energy prices to normalize again and hopefully go back to pre-conflict levels. So our current view is that the shock is going to be persistent. We are going to have to wait some time for things to normalize for a number of reasons. We can think about the transits through the Strait of Hormuz. We know that, for example, tankers have been redirected during the conflict. It's going to take time for them to go back to the same routes. We know that there is a problem with mining, and so there is going to take some time as well to demine the waters of the straits. And all of that obviously is also going to have an impact on war insurance, which is going to increase costs for the transit as well. But then even if you take all of these away and assume that transit is going to normalize very quickly, then you have the war damages or the damages to the facilities of production for oil and in particular for LNG. The initial estimates, at least, of the damages of the energy facilities in Qatar indicated that it would take years for these facilities to go back to pre-conflict levels of production. And for the oil facilities in several countries, it's the estimates is that it's going to take weeks to quarters. And finally, even if all of these shocks are really resolved, or these channels are resolved relatively quickly, we still think that the impacts, especially on inflation, are going to be persistent. Some of the impacts are going to be lagged. You were mentioning before, for example, fertilizers. We know that the spike in fertilizer prices takes some time to actually filter through or get through to agricultural outputs, depending on the planting cycle and so on. And then from there, it's going to go into food inflation. And so we expect food prices and food inflation to increase as well. And obviously, there are other mechanisms that built in this kind of persistence into the pass-through from the spike in energy prices to actual inflation and consumer prices. So for all of these reasons, we think that there is going to be some persistence, and it's going to take some time for the situation to normalize in energy markets. Of course, I mean, the risk premium that was built in prices for a long time because the conflict was ongoing is probably going to fade relatively quickly. We've seen prices go down quickly over the last few days. But the fundamentals, the structural factors that I was mentioning before, are probably going to keep prices higher for some time. The second channel, or the second problem I would mention, is really this uncertainty. So we have no deal or a memorandum of understanding. The credibility or we don't really know whether this is going to be implemented. We were just mentioning now before going live that we don't really know what's in that deal. And whether it's going to be implemented fully or not.
It's an interim deal too. It anticipates another set of negotiations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, this uncertainty is another factor. Just like last year, we were talking about trade uncertainty or trade policy uncertainty. This uncertainty is still going to have an impact on, businesses, business decisions, investment, etc. So, bottom line is that we think this conflict is going to leave some scars and is going to produce persistent effects. So obviously the hope is that the peace deal is going to be implemented and that things are going to go back to some kind of normality relatively quickly.
And just one follow-up question. I outlined some measures that countries took to deal with the shock, including subsidies, working from home, export restrictions, etc. Are there any policies that you think were particularly effective, or policies that you would recommend to countries to avoid in similar situations that they ended up maybe making things worse?
For ADB, I mean, this is something that we've been talking about and recommending for some time, ever since the conflict started, really. So situations like this is really a very large supply side shock, an energy shock, where you want to use really targeted policies and interventions that help the groups in the economy, especially more vulnerable households that are really hit harder than the others. And you want this intervention to be time-bound. You want to make sure that there is limits to the amount of resources that can be spent towards those goals. The alternative is that you have this kind of broad-based subsidies or tax cuts. And these are really problematic for a number of reasons. I mean, just mentioning two, these are usually regressive policies because richer households or wealthier households benefit from these policies more than the poorer, because normally they consume more energy. So that's one. But at the same time, they are really costly from a fiscal point of view. And many economies in Asia don't have that much fiscal space. So you're using these resources for this kind of intervention. You're really crowding out intervention and investment in other areas, which are much more important for the economy in the medium to long term. And finally, it's also blunting the incentives, right? So we are in a situation in which a resource, energy, becomes really scarce. What you want to do is incentivize agents in the economy, households, businesses, to use less of that resource and use it more efficiently. if you use this kind of broad-based subsidies, you are blunting that incentives. And so, there is less of an incentive for energy conservation, which is obviously not a good thing in a shock like this one.
Spoken like a good economist. Thank you. Terazawa-san, over to you. I mean, Japan was really dependent on the Mideast for oil in particular. How did Japan kind of fare through this? And, I would also just say that Japan also has been on the forefront of dealing with its vulnerabilities and dependencies and putting a real emphasis on economic security through the years. Do you think Japan was adequately prepared and took the correct measures to get through this crisis?
We were not perfect, but I think relatively speaking, we have been dealing with this crisis relatively well. And probably this is backed by our decades-long efforts to enhance our energy security. We have to go back to 1973 when we encountered the first oil crisis. And since then, we have been engaged in strengthening of energy security measures. One example is that at the time of this war, we had 254 days worth of stockpiles of crude oil. And our dependence upon LNG coming through the strait was just 6%. And we have fairly diversified our power generation. So in addition to the relatively low dependence upon strait-bound LNG, our dependence upon LNG was very small for that reasons. So in general, we have been doing very well in dealing with this crisis. But there was one missing element, which was naphtha. We were okay with crude oil. We were okay with LNG. We were okay with LPG. We were okay with most oil products, but we were short of naphtha.
Can you just explain to our viewers what is naphtha and why it's so important?
Naphtha is if you refine crude oil, you get various oil products, but sort of the origin, the source of various oil or chemical products is naphtha. Naphtha is a connection, a bridge between crude oil and various oil products and chemical products.
Right. So it's used in a whole array of products.
Right. So if you have shortage of naphtha, you could have shortage of various chemical products. And in Japan, in retrospect, until 1993, we positioned naphtha as part of our energy security. But in 1993, facing the pressure from the industry, we removed naphtha from energy security. And that led to our weakness that until 1993, we had a reserve system for naphtha. But in 1993, we stopped having the reserve system. And now we are paying the price for having deleted naphtha from our energy security. So this is a lesson that we have learned. So we have not been very perfect, but this is something that we will need to improve on to address the future contingencies.
And with the announcement of this new deal, is there optimism in Japan that things are going to get back to some kind of new normal?
Well, it's a positive step, but we remain cautious. As Matteo mentioned, this is just an interim or framework agreement. This is not a formal final agreement. And the most important element, to what extent, to what degree the nuclear program of Iran will be dealt with is unclear. And so without having the core being decided, we are not very much confident about to what extent this agreement would hold. And we are skeptical if the final agreement can be reached within the next 60 days. The control of the nuclear program is very technical and very detailed. And so our expectation is that while we welcome this step as a positive step, probably it would take much longer than 60 days. And during that period of time, we can face a disruption from Israel, for example. I understand Israel is not totally happy with this agreement, so there will be some activities may disrupt this process. And also from our sources in Iran, I think they have become overly confident in their leverage. So Iran can overplay their perceived leverage. So we remain cautious about to what extent this would lead to a formal agreement, and also to what extent that 60 days will be realized. We expect it to take longer. For the economic reasons, I totally agree with Matteo that even if everything is fine with the passage, the normalization of economic activities would take months.
And will it take longer for NAFTA than for naphtha that versus like oil?
Well, oil is basically exporting crude oil, so it's relatively simple, but it takes months. But for naphtha, you are talking about a long and complex supply chain.
Yeah.
So it's not just naphtha. We have to talk about various chemical products along the supply chain. So the resumption of the normal activities of the whole supply chain of naphtha and chemical products will take much longer than the resumption of the export of crude oil.
I think that's an important point because each product will have its own time frame in terms of resuming its position in the economy. Julia, over to you then. How is Southeast Asia viewing this deal? Certain Southeast Asian countries were particularly hit by this crisis. Are you optimistic that things now will slowly improve and you'll be able to secure the types of supplies and commodities you were getting from the Mideast before the crisis broke?
Thanks, Wendy. So I think as you mentioned, Southeast Asia has been hit pretty bad, although there's like quite wide diversity in terms of the vulnerabilities across the different countries, and also depends on what kind of product you're talking, whether it's oil, or LNG and others as well. I think like with other region, the significance of this agreement will basically come down to two things. One is in the detail. We know that this is only a framework agreement, if you like, and countries have agreed. The parties have agreed to continue negotiating for the next 60 days, and that's when I think we will start to see what how the details will emerge. The second one, I think, which is probably a bigger risk, is whether the agreement itself would hold, not only by the two parties involved in the agreement, but also by others as well within the perimeter of the conflict, if you like. Countries are unlikely to fully wind down the emergency measures that they put in place. I think they're gonna take a more wait and see attitude. Some of those sort of ease in price, I think there will be some decline in price, but not so much to the level of what it was before. But some of the measures that the countries took, for example, some of them has basically reduced taxes on oil and gas products. So the different countries are actually responding differently, right? Some fully absorb the cost of the price increase for subsidized fuel, so at least they would provide some ease to the fiscal space for that particular country, like Indonesia, for example. And the other places, I think the hope is for some of that to at least trickle down to the users. But what all this crisis has shown is that countries has now realized not to take the supply chain for granted. So all the ongoing efforts, whether that's to diversify energy sources or energy routes, becomes very, very, very important. And you see that countries actually start cooperating with each other. We're gonna be discussing more about this later, to basically strengthen their energy supply chain resilience for the medium to the long term. One good thing I think we can note is that the crisis, you do see some sort of going back, unfortunately, to the use of coal and so on at times of emergencies. But at the same time, it gives added momentum for transition towards renewables. And I think that's actually, at least that's probably the silver lining in this crisis.
Mm-hmm. And a follow-up question to you with your ASEAN hat on. Did ASEAN play an important role or even a minimal role in trying to bring the country, the members together to try and deal with this crisis, in a coordinated manner?
Yeah. So ASEAN has been quite quick to respond, although there is some gap in those responses, right? They've been quite quick to respond. And energy security cooperation is not actually new in ASEAN. There's been quite a number of relevant initiatives that's been in place for decades. So the crisis has definitely brought the country together to reaffirm their commitment and to commit to actually accelerate the implementation of many of these frameworks that has been in place for years, if not decades. But there's always been the limit to regional frameworks, right? It provides a framework for countries to come together, but ultimately when it comes to implementation, whether that's cross-border power trade, whether that's the development of power grid, for example, the ASEAN power grid, or even more recently, people are very interested in the ASEAN Petroleum Security Agreement. Ultimately, when it comes to the practical implementation, it goes down to countries level, whether that's voluntary or commercial basis or trilateral basis. But it provides that space and mechanics to basically bring countries together.
Mm-hmm. At least at a minimum to exchange information and to court and Okay, Jenny, last but not least again, over to you. I mean, you've heard what our other panelists have shared with respect not only to the impact on their country or part of Asia, but also just broader concerns, particularly with respect to supply chains. We seem to be honing in on that a bit. What's your take on all of this? And are you more optimistic in terms of things maybe getting back to normal more quickly? The other speakers seem to think that, it's going to take some time. Where do you come out on this?
I'm in the sometime camp, and the uncertainty is actually considerable. So I think there's some really big macroeconomic impacts for this that are long term, and the food is one that really shouldn't be discounted. We tend to think about it at a national level, but I just look at Australia and look at the reduction in area being planted, and we had reasonably good pre-purchases of a lot of fertilizer before the Strait of Hormuz was closed. And yet still we saw a significant reduction. We also saw a change in what they planted. So they moved to products that needed less fertilizer. And so that's a common pattern in a lot of places. And so those effects will play through into global food prices. And we also know that global food prices are one of those things that really can be a trigger for civil unrest in places that where they're not well looked after. So you've got some real sort of extra shocks coming down the line that have, that they're just this big ripple effects. And so hopefully, when you throw a rock in a pond, you kind of, the ripples slowly kind of fade away. The concern here is that you might have other shocks and actually start getting things that reinforce the waves. And so we really need to be looking for what policies we can have that dampen down the ripples rather than the ones that reinforce the waves. And so, I mean, Julia was talking about, the ASEAN approaches, but how hard it is. You can get the conversations going, you can get the exchange of information, but to actually get this kind of cooperation that might mean that you actually have to sacrifice a little bit of something now for cooperation in the future. And so what every country is looking for is leverage, some sort of strategic leverage. And so for Australia, LNG, we could have a conversation with Japan about our LNG and say we need refined fuel because we've only got 2 refineries still operating. And so there's kind of a tit for tat. And so the problem with tit for tat agreements is, it's sort of on the first round, they're mutually advantageous, but they have ripple effects. And so what does it do for the people who are outside those agreements? And so there's an enormous challenge here with which we were already under with the sort of the geopolitical rivalry and the contestation, particularly in Asia, between which great power do you align with? Can you kind of play the game of, cooperating with both and engaging with both the US and China? And this is just kind of shaking everything up and even more. So I'm concerned about those long run macro effects. And you don't want to be a glass half empty type of person. But on the other hand, if you don't start saying we really need to cooperate and work together to solve some of these problems, then we're not going to end up in a situation where we don't have those problems. So we really need to be kind of thinking about how do we manage the risks that are out there coming through. And that's if all goes well and the strait opens, right? Because of the time it's going to take for things to come through. And the problem is that, problems of this nature in the making, you can't switch to renewables quickly. That's a big investment strategy. You have to put the infrastructure in place. You have to work out how you're going to fund the capital build and the like. And even just getting land rights in some places to build this stuff is hard. So the fixes are slow, and we've kind of put them off. And so even though we sort of say, well, we'll move towards it now, the risk of disruption in moving towards it is quite considerable, that we'll go for short-term, quick fix solutions. And you saw it in things like not letting prices rise. So Mateo's absolutely right. You've got to resend some price signals. And what we sent was, I think our Australian Prime Minister said at Easter time, everybody should just go and have their Easter holidays as they planned, and cut the excise on fuel so that people didn't have to pay quite as much at the pump. But what you're not getting then is the change in behaviour you're going to need. It's kind of like, it'll be all okay, guys. Everybody wants reassurance. But they're going to have to rebuild all those stockpiles, and they won't just rebuild the stockpiles to what they had before. Everybody's going to want bigger stockpiles. And so you're going to have just a higher cost base across the whole sort of situation.
Because there'll be more competition, more demand, more demand requests, right. Therefore.
And bringing new sources online is going to take time. So this is the challenge. We're going to have to work out how do we cooperate so we don't let, the sort of the conflicts that could arise either domestically or externally on the borders explode into something that then really becomes problematic. Yeah. So I think this is where cooperation really, really, really matters.
Yeah. And we'll get into that, but just one question for you, kind of following what I asked Julia too about ASEAN. Do you see any role for the World Trade Organization here? I know they're facing their own challenges, but just a question, because, when you talk about these types of issues, they are related to, obviously, to trade flows and the WTO mandate.
Yes, no, I actually think that they've got a really important role to play, because they provide a forum and a platform where people can get together, and they've got mechanisms in place that where you, at least if you can get an agreement with like a multi-party agreement, you can have enforcement mechanisms. So I think they're really important. And I think that the really important thing is actually the trying to remember what it's called, the agreement on technical barriers to trade, because the temptation is going to be for everybody to look after their own. And you mentioned we had some export controls. So saying, well, you can't export, the products that we're going to need if you happen to be a net exporter. And so there's going to be actions that will look rational at an individual country level, but once you get reciprocity or, reactions of other countries, then the whole thing can escalate. So that's where I think the WTO rules can be really useful, and using those platforms to sort of say, yes, you might think this is a good idea, but is it a good idea in the long term? So short term leads to a bunch of reactions, and what do those reactions look like? And can we make sure that we're considering those when making those policy decisions?
Good. So let's then move to this cooperation element. And one thing I would just put on the table, that when you look at these cooperation mechanisms between countries in the region that have been announced, they're all between, as far as I know, between middle powers, right? Because the U.S. and China, we were kind of on the sidelines of all of this. The U.S., we were fighting the war. China, my understanding is put in some export restrictions for a short period of time, but largely, stayed on the sidelines. And that put a lot of pressure on middle-sized countries to kind of come together and to find other partners that could help them through this crisis. So Teruzel, maybe I'll start with you then. Japan early on announced, I think your prime minister announced this $10 billion kind of fund to help Asian countries. Can you tell us a little about that, and also about what Japan has done with Korea or other partners in the region to either kind of help certain countries through the crisis, but also to help Japan through the crisis as well, through these cooperation mechanisms.
Just quickly, Prime Minister Takaichi announced on April 15th at the ASIC Plus Summit meeting. ASIC stands for Asia Zero Emission Community Summit. And her initiative, which is called POWERR, POWERR initiative, had the largest pillar being providing, as you said, $10 billion financing to help the Asian countries to procure more expensive energy, and also to help the Asian countries to strengthen their emergency reserves. So this was basically designed to be ASIC plus other countries' initiative. So it was much more regional, so to speak. And in bilateral terms, the leaders of Japan and Vietnam agreed for Japan to help Vietnam make access to crude oil, and also Vietnam making a promise to prioritize their export of oil products to Japan. So this was a sort of bilateral collaboration. We engaged in another different bilateral agreement between the Philippines, between the two leaders. And based on this agreement, Japan pledged to support Philippines to build up their emergency reserves for the future. We are doing this. Prime Minister Takaichi is doing on a piece-by-piece basis as of now. But I think we have to have a much more systematic view of the challenge we're facing. As you may know, Wendy, you mentioned WTO, but probably the more relevant international organization would be IEA. IEA stands for International Energy Agency. IEA was created by Dr. Henry Kissinger in response to the first oil crisis, to have the advanced economies get together to collaborate and build up the SPR, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, to deal with potential disruption of the supply. And IEA has played a very important role since then, and even during the current crisis, IEA has playing a very important role. Having said so, this crisis, as have been discussed, is a global crisis, but it's much more of an Asian crisis. IEA is helpful, but IEA does not necessarily address all the problems we are facing. Number one, the decision making process in IEA, if you look at the membership, out of the 32 members, there are only 3 Asian countries as members. I may have to include Australia, but narrowly define Australia. And that 3 countries include Turkey. So I'm not quite sure if Asia Society has Turkey as a member. So narrowly defined Asia, just Japan and ROK are being members. Predominantly, it's more of a European organization. So the decision making is not necessarily addressing the crisis in Asia. Frankly, the sense of crisis in Europe is much lower this time compared with 4 years ago when Russia invaded Ukraine, number one. Number two, IEA was designed as a club of advanced economies. So each country was supposed to come up with their obligation on their own of building up their reserves. But for Asia, many countries cannot do it on their own. They need to have support, including financing. And probably Prime Minister Takaichi touched upon this by pledging a financing to help countries procure expensive energy and also build up their emergency reserve. I think it was a sort of an ad hoc measure, but I think if there could be something positive to evolve out of this crisis, maybe we should have a discussion to develop a system to complement IEA, not to replace, but complement IEA, that we can have an Asian-wide energy security sort of system. And the decision would be made by the Asian countries with a support mechanism to help countries which cannot act as a club member, and also expand beyond oil, because the current crisis extends beyond oil. IEA is basically about oil. It could be about LNG, it could be materials, it could be about fertilizers. So an expanded scope, and also a mechanism to help each other in the case of difficulties like the swapping of products in a more systematic manner. And I think this is something that we can build upon ASEC, Asia Zero Emission Community, when there was a ASEC Plus Summit meeting. In addition to ASEC members, which are mostly ASEAN members plus Japan and Australia, we had special guests like ROK, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and East Timor joining. So potentially, we could develop something to enhance energy security, but also help the energy transition. ASEC, Asia Zero Emission Community, was designed to help energy transition, but we can have two pillars: helping energy transition, but also enhancing energy security. And as Wendy pointed out, historically, the U.S. always was the leader, but this time, I'm sorry to say, but we cannot expect the U.S. to take the lead. This is an Asian issue, Asian crisis, and maybe together with ADB, I think Asian countries should stand up and build a complementary system together. And I think this is something we can do, especially with ADB and also with ASEAN countries, and also our friends in Australia as well.
So, Matteo, maybe, yeah.
I was just going to ask a quick question, actually, because I mean it's really important to frame that cooperation beyond, because stockpiles themselves, at what point do they provide you security? How many days do you need? They were meant to be short-term disruptions and to smooth out the short-term disruptions. And so it's fine if countries have their disruption at one point in time and somebody else gets a disruption at another point in time because your refinery blew up or your trade route got blocked or whatever. But when you have these global disruptions, you start looking at something really different. So it's just really interesting to hear Terazawa-san explain that you really need to have a broader system, that they need to be thinking it's not just about stockpiling, but it's actually about systems of, not just ensuring each other, but actually developing something that is an alternative way of supplying the energy we need. Sorry, just
that's a great point. Yeah, appreciate it.
You're right. When the crisis is country specific, we can help each other easily. But if the challenge is global, every country is under pressure. So it's more difficult to help each other. But having said so, ensuring that everyone has a certain level of buffer in peaceful times would provide a cushion against even a global contingency, number one. And number two, as I said, many countries in Asia cannot afford to pay for the building up of the reserve, which is very expensive. And by helping them to build up the reserve in peaceful times, provides a cushion for members of Asia, which is good to help our friends. But from Japan, Asia is a major market for us. So we need the soundness of Asia. And also Asia is a major supply chain for us. So we need to have a functioning of Asia as a major source of supply chain. So it helps our friends in Asia. It helps us as well to develop that system in place in peaceful time. In addition to stockpiling, energy efficiency enhancement is very important. And this is something that Japan, as a leader in energy efficiency, can help our friends in Asia, because with economic growth, the demand for energy will be growing dramatically. Without energy efficiency measures, that will put stress on carbon dioxide emissions and also stress on energy. Energy efficiency enhancement is needed than any time in the past. And this is also another way we can enhance our energy security and together. And ASEAN could play a role, but frankly, with ASEAN alone, you do not have enough financing or technology. So that's the reason why ASEAN plus Japan, Australia, ROK, or India put together could lead us to having that kind of a better systemic approach to be more resilient against future shocks. This is not to replace IEA. This is to complement IEA. But I think this is important. And Asia has not been known to be leading some initiative. But since this is an Asian crisis, and from this crisis, I think it is time for Asia to stand up and take some leadership initiatives together.
So, Matteo, over to you. I'd be really interested in how you would respond to Terazawa-san's suggestion. Is this something that you think is realistic or needed, or what challenges are out there that he hasn't touched upon?
Let me answer again as an economist, maybe. I think the incentives are in place. I totally agree with Terazawa-san arguments. We are a few years ago, people were talking about a new normal. I think we are in a new normal. It's been a series of different global shocks, starting with the pandemic in 2020, and then we had two energy shocks. We had, the trade environment changing completely and still evolving. It's definitely a different environment, global environment, than it was a few years ago. So the idea that there is a need to build resilience against these external shocks, external to the Asian region, something that is now, built in economic strategies and political strategies. And each one of the economies that we were talking about, you were mentioning middle powers, these are too small by themselves to build the kind of resilience that you need. And so it makes a lot of sense. And as I was saying, the incentives are there for these powers or these economies to come together and build the institutions that you need, or the kind of collaboration that you need to build this kind of resilience. In ADB, we've been stressing for a long time now the need for more and better, more efficient regional cooperation and integration. And this goes from the kind of infrastructure that was mentioned before. The ASEAN power grid is one example, but many others as well, to the kind of political institutions or coordination institutions that we were talking about now. And I agree, especially with the argument that, this is a global shock, but the effects of the shock are asymmetric. They depend on how vulnerable economies are, how exposed economies are to this global shock. In ADB, we have economies, member countries that go from Central Asia to the Pacific. And obviously, there's a huge heterogeneity. Some Central Asian economies, they are net energy exporters. So higher energy prices are actually a good thing from that point of view. But Pacific economies is very difficult. They have, they import essentially all of the fuel, all of the energy that they need. And it's also very difficult to actually, ship this energy, this oil to those economies. So same shock, totally different effects, which again creates an opportunity for this kind of coordination and this kind of sharing of the burden within economies. And to be honest, again, this is a very focused webinar, a very focused discussion. But if we just step out and look at other things that are happening in the global economy, we are in the midst maybe of one in a generation technological revolution, and artificial intelligence is going to maybe change everything in a few years. And again,
well, it's going to increase the demand for energy for sure.
Exactly, that's for sure. And we have two big players, and in the middle, we have all of the other economies that are going to have to decide what to do and how to do it. So that's, again, a place and an area where more coordination and discussion will be very, very viable. So I do see the incentives in place. I hope that we are going to continue going into that direction. As it's already been mentioned, a few green shoots, a few things have been happening. Past crisis, that we've seen that some of this gains or these positive externalities remain. Obviously, there is going to be a tendency to go back to normal after the crisis is over. But hopefully some of these improvements are going to be in place, because really the moment to build this kind of institutions is not during the crisis, is when you have the time and you have the resources to do it. So yeah, that would be my hope.
Julia, I really welcome your views here. Do you think Southeast Asian countries would be interested in some kind of new mechanism along the lines of what Terazawa-san described, kind of bringing not only, it would also bring in countries like Japan who could help finance some of the Southeast Asian projects trying to deal with the economic fallouts?
Thanks, Wendy. I mean, in fact, I think some of those facilities are already in place, right? The ASEAN sort of green financing facilities. ADB has long been one of the key partner, for example, in the implementation of the ASEAN power grid. But financing alone often is not the only or impediment, if you like, to regional cooperations in ASEAN. You have other factors as well, from regulatory disparity, you know, lack of a regulatory convergence. It could be lack of sort of shared urgency among some of the countries on the specific projects. And this is when ultimately it needs to go down to the ground level, right? Seeing which borders perhaps or which sub-regions actually have momentum to actually push some of those cooperation forward. And that's only in the energy security. What ASEAN is also already have in place and actually also deepening is actually the broader crisis cooperations, if you like. And in ASEAN, I mean, other than some of those initiatives around the energy security, there's quite already a number of sector-specific crisis response mechanism in place, whether that's financial, whether that's food security, whether that's emergency.
But are they working?
I think some are working. So, for example, during COVID, there's the ASEAN Pandemic Fund, and then I think there is also a greater information exchange. But you're right, in some cases, some of these mechanism has never even been triggered, if you like, right? I think that's something that have to be seen. But there's two things that ASEAN is basically looking at now. One is this realization that the crisis these days are a lot more complex and is multidimensional, and this sector-specific crisis response mechanism might not be as effective. You actually sometimes do need a whole of ASEAN approach to dealing with this crisis. You need to basically have the institutional nimbleness to not separate crisis into, you know, whether that's only energy, food. I mean, in this case, it's a security-driven economic shocks, right? In the case of Iran, that's one. But what can ASEAN do as a region? Recently, ASEAN upgraded its ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement, in which it includes the provisions around trade in times of crisis. And this is not new. There's already model provisions out there. And I think these are the kind of thing that needs to be promoted. One of the, I would say, imminent opportunities for this is actually the general review of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement that's going to come up in 2027. And that includes countries precisely including Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and China. And if there is a way for countries to actually come together and include this emerging need for such provisions in the upgraded version of RCEP, I think that's probably one way where regional cooperation can help to strengthen economic resilience in the face of future crises.
Interesting. Yeah. No, I was thinking of RCEP before just because of the membership, but it also seems to be pretty kind of overloaded with other updating issues as well.
Yeah.
So to put this on the agenda would probably, you know, add considerable, work.
Yeah. They have to be it's not a general review in the business as usual sense, I would say. So they will have to be quite efficient and strict in prioritizing what they would like to generate. It's not the only general review that they would have anyway, but what they need to prioritize.
Yeah, exactly. So Jenny, maybe I can ask you, what are your views on either like plurilateral, like let's just say plurilateral or like Asian cooperation mechanism to deal with issues like this? And do you think that, I mean, you know, a lot of times what happens is that even though the best time to work on stuff like this is once a crisis recedes, but in reality, countries kind of quickly go back to normal. And sometimes they don't see the urgency anymore. So what are your views here?
Well, you always say you should never let a good crisis go to waste, right? And so, but I do think, you know, these like CTPPT and then also the RCEP, they form platforms. And so one of the challenges is we've got, you know, you're a former trade negotiator, you would know this well, you've got this kind of ways of doing things that we have that are very formulaic and they're long established over a long period of time. Countries come with their wish lists that they get from businesses and everybody else. And so I think we're going to have to sort of do something different. We've got to actually find a different way to have a negotiation, because we've got to sort of start from where are the core interests that we need to cooperate on that will counter the big risks out there. And what are our big risks? Well, you've got the risk from climate change and the natural disasters and that set of risks. We've got the risk from the geopolitical power. We've got the risks from just the fact with AI and the level of, interconnectedness and cyber risks associated with all of that. So we've just got these layers of risk that we've got a common interest in dealing in, right? And so going through the sort of standard negotiating practice of everybody coming with their wish lists, and then sort of, it's an argy-bargy and we're thinking about trade and negotiating coin. We've got to think of these more about platforms where countries can find some common ground on things they really want to work on. They agree and they can invite others to join them on it.
More ad hoc then.
More ad hoc, but use the agreements that we have as platforms. You don't need to reinvent wheels. It's sort of, you've got the WTO there. It's sort of achieved massive gains, right? So we got, under the GATT, we got the tariffs rates right down in ways that benefited, huge numbers of countries, right?
It worked for a while.
Have a debate about, countries following rules and countries not following rules and the like. But at a certain level, it then what it does now is provide a platform for those discussions and negotiations. So if we don't rethink how we go about doing them, we'll get a bit stuck in this sort of taking 3, 5, 10, never actually getting an agreement because we're looking for unilateral, for everybody to sign on, or we're looking for, the perfect getting in the way of the good. And yet somehow we need to work out how we actually say, let's make these trade-offs. Let's go with this. Let's think about the packages where your politicians have always got some wins and they can go back and tell their people they got some wins, because I think that's important to sell packages, domestically. But we really just need everybody to rethink how we go about doing these things.
Yeah. Sometimes starting smaller is easier. If you try and take on too much at the outset, it gets overwhelming quickly. We just have a few more minutes. I thought we'd have just a final lightning round. And the question I'm going to ask everyone, and you've 1 minute, okay, is what would you advise our viewers to be watching to see how quickly, economic recovery can happen in the region? Are there certain things you'll be watching? Including, of course, you'll probably all say is what happens to this agreement. It's interim after 60 days, et cetera. I'm going to take that one off the table for everyone. Are there things that we should be watching, either with respect to a certain product or, or there's certain countries, if they withdraw some of the subsidies they put in, is that a sign that seems like things are getting on a better track? So, Matteo, let me start with you because you've probably given some thought to this or written about this.
There are several indicators. I think,
1 minute
two
here.
Things.
So, okay.
Okay. So the first one is the difference between the price of physical oil, so deliveries of actual physical oil barrels, and the international price. So this has diverged initially during the crisis, kind of converged, but there is still a difference. And that's really an indicator of how things, how bad or how good things are on the ground. And the second one is something that we didn't discuss, but it's really global liquidity and global financial conditions. So we have a new Fed chairman, and today was the first, formal speech. And there is now a clear bias, or at least markets expect the Fed to have a significantly tighter monetary policy stance than before, because inflation is higher, and this is going to have repercussions in the region as well. So I think these two indicators are important for energy and for monetary policy.
Good. Julia, what would you add? What will you be watching?
Okay, I think I'll be probably 3 things. One is it's very interesting to see what are these emerging bilateral and trilateral agreements that's been in place. Some are much more ad hoc. One of the trade-off, Indonesia exporting urea fertilizers to Australia and buying phosphate from Australia. Others are much more long-term supply chain resilience agreement between Singapore and New Zealand, a binding one, for example. Two much more sort of innovative, localized solutions, or what they hope to be solutions. In Southeast Asia, we have a lot of this blended fuel, given the feedstock that we have. And there's a growing interest as well in the search of alternative routes, because I think supply chain choke points now is a real concerns. And I think last but not least, really hoping to see real acceleration in the energy transition in the region. Whether that's the pickup in some of these big initiatives that we have, or really like finally a real takeoff in the adoptions of the renewable and the green technologies as well, just to improve energy security within the region.
Excellent. Jenny, over to you.
Food prices. That's probably one that I think, if you start seeing real pressure on staples prices, then either because countries are restraining exports or because just there's a shortage, then we need to be looking at the ramifications of how that goes down the line.
And Terazawa-san, you got the final word.
That's tough. In the short term, I think we have to look at the what's happening with the shortage or the concerned shortage of the supply of energy. For Japan, as I said, it's naphtha. For India, it's LPG. And for Vietnam, Philippines, I believe it will be gasoline and diesel fuel, and maybe for Australia, the same. So if we can go over that concern for the fiscal shortage concern, I think we would have overcome the initial challenge of the current crisis. The price effect will linger on, but I think the physical shortage concern, if we can overcome that, that will be a major first success. But as my colleagues have talked about, we hope and we sincerely hope that we can just go back to normal. The 1973 first oil shock led to the creation of IEA, but also it led to the start of G7 process. So hopefully with this crisis, after going through the first initial physical supply shortage, if Asia can come together to develop something, I'm not having the quite answer to what that would be, but a system to enhance our energy resilience in Asia, and also, as Julia said, a mechanism to help promote the energy transition in the region. So both energy transition and energy resilience, they go hand in hand. If we come up with a good system on an Asian-wide basis, complementing the existing international framework, I'm not talking about replacing them, I think that would be something could be a legacy for the future as a midterm and long-term potential success for Asia.
Well, great. And with that, I want to thank our panelists. We think we've had a really rich discussion. And if anything, I feel like I need to bring you all back in 6 months so we can continue this discussion and see where we are. But thanks to everyone for joining us, and a special thanks to our panelists for taking the time and just sharing your insights. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.